billion. And as you mentioned, Sarah Jacobson, she did a terrific press release. She's from San Diego, and a video about war and how war is not the answer. The others who voted against the increase, the other Democrats, included Adam Smith, who's the chair of the House Armed Services Committee, Rick Larson, John Garamendi, Jackie Spear, Donald Norcross, Ruben Gallego, Ro Khanna, as you mentioned, William Keating, Andy Kim, Chrissy Houlihan, Jason Crow, Veronica Escobar, Joseph Morell, Sarah Jacobs, Marilyn Strickland, and Jimmy Panetta. Those were the no votes, and we can thank them for that. All right. Now, Medea, Hani, if there's nothing else you want to add, we can go right into our program.
Yeah, I'm more than delighted to introduce Sonali. I think you covered it all. And for those of you who know.
Oh, but wait, I'm sorry, honey, 1 second. Can we have Carly just say something about the campaign we're launching on September 12th?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So, September 11th, as everyone knows, is coming up this Saturday, the 20th anniversary of September 11th. CODEPINK is hosting an excellent webinar, which will include many great voices, co-hosting that with Massachusetts Peace Action. And that's on our calendar, and I'll make sure people have access to that so they can sign up. It's going to be via Zoom. But the day after September 11th, the 20th anniversary, we're going to be launching a new and very important, very exciting campaign to do what we needed to do since the beginning. Now that we've seen the failed strategy of the US war on terror, when we've spent over $21 trillion, a new study out from the National Priorities Project showed us that. It's now time to do what we needed to do all along and cut the Pentagon budget, right? So we're launching a new campaign on September 12th called Cut the Pentagon. We're launching a new website that goes along with it. And we're going to be every day for the next 100 days from September 12th onward, hosting events in Washington, D.C. and around the country to call on members of Congress to cut the Pentagon budget and really create the intersectional movement that we need to cut the Pentagon budget for people, peace, and planet. So we'll make sure that's in the chat, and everyone will have access to that.
Excellent, great. Thank you so much, Carly. All right, Hania, would you like to introduce the first guest?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I remember Marcy once when Sonali was on one of our CODEPINK calls, you got so emotional reading her bio. And that's because she has accomplished so much in her life as a young woman. And I feel the same, very overwhelmed right now. So I hope I do it justice. Sonali Kolhatkar is a journalist, activist, and artist. She is the author of Bleeding Afghanistan, Washington Warlords, and the Propaganda of Silence. Sonali is the founding co-director of Afghan Women's Mission, a US-based nonprofit solidarity organization that funds the work RAWA, which stands for Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan. Sonali is also the executive producer of daily drive time television and radio news show called The Rising Up with Sonali. Sonali Kolhatkar was born and raised in Dubai, United Arab Emirates, to Indian parents. She is the granddaughter of the famed Indian independence leader and freedom fighter S.Y. Kolhatkar, who founded the Communist Party of India. In 1991, at the age of 16, Sonali left her family and moved to the United States for higher education. In 1996, she obtained a Bachelor's of Science in Physics and Bachelor's of Arts in Astronomy with special honors from the University of Texas at Austin. In 1996, she obtained a Master's of Science in Astrophysics from the University of Hawaii in Manoa. In March 22, Sonali left astronomy to pursue radio. Welcome, Sonali Kolhatkar.
Thank you so much, honey. I really appreciate it. And a tiny little update to the bio. The show is now a weekly program from a daily show, and I also started a job as the new racial justice editor at Yes Magazine, transitioning into print journalism. I'm always honored to be part of CODEPINK's work. Been a long-time admirer. I remember when CODEPINK first started. Can't believe it's been 20 years since the September 11th attacks. And I've seen folks like Medea, like Phyllis, who are, leaders in the anti-war movement talk about the futility of war for so long. And I myself, having been involved with doing solidarity work with Afghan women, I know Phyllis, Medea, and so many others feel really kind of sad at how vindicated we've been in sounding the alarm for 20 years. I would have loved to have been wrong about the Afghan war, but right from 2001, October 7, 2001, I was trying to tell anybody who would listen what RAWA, the women's group that I worked with, was saying, which is, you can't bomb your way to peace. You can't bomb your way to women's rights. And you certainly can't do it while at the same time embracing Taliban-like fundamentalists. You can't pick and choose which fundamentalists you're going to decide are your enemy while embracing others that have very similar ideologies. And the US did that. So here we are 20 years later, and 20 years of futility, of trillions of dollars spent, of countless lives lost, and the situation somewhat back where we started with the Taliban back in power, and in other ways, much worse because, of course, of the lives lost and the chaos and the trauma for a 20-year-old who has known nothing but war, maybe born to a 40-year-old who has known nothing but war either. So I was asked to talk a little bit about Afghan women because everyone's always interested in what is happening with Afghan women. And part of that desire to know what's going on with Afghan women is our conditioning by the mainstream media, who right from the start, from 2001, focused on Afghan women's rights as a marker for what the US should be doing, as a sort of a palatable way to justify the war. We were not only going to defeat the host of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan linked to the September 11th attacks, we were, by the same token, going to bring freedom to Afghan women. So from the start of this 20-year-old war, the mainstream media and the administrations that have been in power have linked freeing Afghan women and liberating Afghan women to the attacks on the Taliban, to the war itself. It's true that women's well-being, health, education, mortality, maternal mortality rates, child mortality rates, all these indicators are very much measures of a society's progress. When women are free, when they have access to education, employment, when they're safe, when they feel safe, when they have good health indicators, generally it's a measure of societal well-being, of democratic rights, of human rights. So in some ways, it is important, of course, for us to focus on Afghan women's rights, divorcing that from the fact that the US thought it could bring freedom via war. Afghan women's maternal mortality rates and Afghan children's child mortality rates were among the highest in the world in 2001. That has not changed very much at all. Afghan women starting in the mid-1990s till 2001, 2002, had no access to education because the Taliban shut down schools. Over the past 20 years, although US tax dollars were used to build schools in Afghanistan, many were burnt down after they were built. Women weren't allowed to go to school, or if they were threatened, they had acid thrown on their faces. Education has largely remained out of reach for Afghan women. The situation in Afghanistan for Afghan women has been so bad that a few years ago, and we're not hearing very much about this in the media coverage today, there was a terrifying new trend seen in Afghanistan of self-immolation. Afghan women were literally burning themselves to death. So much so that they had burn units that were started in Herat and other parts of Afghanistan, in rural areas where women were so depressed, were so suicidal that they were setting themselves on fire in a dramatic way of leaving this world. And many, survived with horrific burns. That happened during the US occupation, right? And yet it was touted by our mainstream media as, here's what could happen if the US were to leave Afghanistan under the Taliban, with no sense of irony that this was actually happening under the US occupation to Afghan women. And so none of this was surprising to me, to others who paid close attention to the Afghanistan war, to, of course, the Afghan women that I work with, RAWA, the Revolutionary Association of the Women of Afghanistan, to Afghanistan's former parliamentarian Malalai Joya, author of A Woman Among Warlords, considered one of the bravest women in Afghanistan. They kept warning us. And if you sort of, by and large, you can see the US occupation being split into two halves. This is a little bit reductive, but it helps to understand it. In the first half of the occupation, the US embraced the Mujahideen, the Northern Alliance, the jihadi warlords, whatever you want to call them. They've gone by different names. These militia leaders that can be traced back to the CIA's funding and arming against the Soviet occupation. The US embraced them in the first half of the occupation, invited them into the government. So these men, armed men who were misogynist, were embraced. Second half of the occupation, the US first secretly and then openly basically began working with the Taliban as a prerequisite for an exit from the US war. And of course, we all want the exit from the US war. We have wanted it. But in doing so, the US made very clear that it was perfectly happy to partner with misogynists. So laying bare this hypocrisy of liberating Afghan women. So you've had an occupation marked by the embrace of one kind of warlord or another or both throughout. It is no wonder that at the end of this occupation, Afghan women remain not just unliberated, but remain deeply traumatized and in either the same or worse condition than before. The great journalist Anand Gopal, who's been covering Afghanistan from the inside for many years, had a wonderful piece in the New Yorker recently. I highly recommend you read it. It just came out a couple of days ago. And it's a lengthy piece. It's called The Other Afghan Women. And I just want to quote from near the end of his article where he basically spoke to Afghan women in rural Afghanistan. Remember, like 70% of Afghanistan's population lives outside the cities, right? They live outside Kabul. They live outside Kandahar, these big cities where there were some measures of some freedoms for women. 70% of the population lives in rural Afghanistan. The women that live in those areas were the women that Anand Gopal painstakingly worked to speak with. And what he found was that these women had a very different view of the US occupation than, say, women in Kabul. One woman said to him, "Is this justice? This is not women's rights when you are killing us, killing our brothers, killing our fathers." One woman named Khalida said, "The Americans did not bring us any rights. They just came, fought, killed, and left." And that sort of sums it up. Recently, we saw a protest by Afghan women in Kabul who were holding up signs. The Taliban tolerated them for a few hours as they marched and then, of course, eventually cracked down on them. The Taliban knows that Western media are paying attention to what's happening to women in Kabul. So they are pandering to US media coverage. They know that they're not taken and haven't been taken seriously because by the world stage because of their misogynist views. And so they've sort of tolerated a little bit, some ostensible women's agitation as an effort to show that they're pro-women. But that protest in Kabul was shut down. Protesters were beaten up. The women's group that I work with, RAWA, had many photographs from that protest. I suspect they might have organized the protest. They're an underground women's organization, so they cannot openly take credit for any organized action because their members are underground and they live in fear, have lived in fear for 20 years and even before that, of openly identifying themselves as activists and organizers. But these women in Kabul basically said, you can't turn back the clock on women's rights. Women's rights are human rights. And there's a deep democratic, indigenous desire in Afghanistan for women's rights that has little, if anything, to do with Western notions of women's rights. There have been Afghan women inside Afghanistan that, like women everywhere, want freedom, want liberation, want education, want access to full rights. They want to be able to participate in society. They were predating both the US occupation, the Taliban rule, the Mujahideen civil war, and the Soviet occupation. The Soviets came in wanting the same thing, saying they were coming to liberate Afghan women. And they killed, there were 1.5 million Afghans killed over 10 years. And the Soviets left doing very little to advance women's rights beyond some cosmetic issues. So regime after regime has come in saying that they want to bring freedom to Afghan women at the barrel of a gun. Afghan women have said over and over again, they want freedom on their own terms. And I'll leave you with just one quote from RAWA, which is the organization, again, that I work with, who I spoke to them very recently about what they wanted and how they responded to the end of the occupation. And they just said that we want, our fear now is that the world will forget Afghanistan and Afghan women, just like they did under the Taliban's rule in the late 1990s. Therefore, the US progressive people and institutions should not forget Afghan women. And Rawa says, we will raise our voice louder and continue our resistance and fight for secular democracy and women's rights. They want to struggle themselves without Western intervention, without Western government intervention, for women's rights, for human rights. And I think it's incumbent on progressives here in the US to support them, because ultimately it's about human rights, it's about people, it's about what we want to envision as a world for ourselves and for people everywhere. And if we simply want an end to the US war so that we can walk away going, all right, our tax dollars aren't going directly towards hurting people anymore, or we're going to wash our hands off of this, that unfortunately is a slap in the face of Afghan women who have had to live with the consequences of our very, very destructive wars for so many years. The least that we as progressive activists can do is keep supporting Afghan women individually through institutional help, through any kind of solidarity that we can do while keeping our government off of their backs. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank
Sonali.
you. Thank you so much, Sonali. That was beautiful. And thank you for your years and years of clarity and working directly with the Afghan women. I know there's been a lot of division among women's groups because some of them had supported the invasion and are now wondering what their positions should be. And I always think if they would listen to you, they would have a much clearer position for the last 20 years. There was a bit of static when you talked, Sonali, and maybe we could try to fix that before we get to the Q&A. And I want to make sure that's not on our end. So do you hear any static when I'm speaking? No? Okay. So hopefully we won't hear it with Phyllis when we get you on. So Phyllis is our next speaker. She is with the Institute for Policy Studies based in Washington, D.C., and also on the Amsterdam-based Transnational Institute. She writes and speaks widely across the United States and throughout the world on issues of the Middle East, ranging from Israel, Palestine, Syria, Iraq. And on the issue of Afghanistan, she's been writing for many years, including her book, Ending the U.S. War in Afghanistan, a primer. She also has the book Before and After, U.S. Foreign Policy and the War on Terrorism. If you listen to Democracy Now!, you would have heard her recently several times there. If you read The Nation, you would have read her wonderful pieces. So we are really delighted to get the clarity of vision that we always get from Phyllis. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Medea, and thanks, Sonali, for an amazing presentation. That was really, really useful. And thanks to CODEPINK for organizing tonight, and to all of you who have come to talk about this, this crucial question of what happens now. I want to talk mostly about what I think we should be demanding of our government. But before I get there, there's a couple of other things I did want to say. One is that this is a hard time, I think, for those of us who have fought against this war, this 20-year war for 20 years. It's very hard because while we have fought to end the US war in Afghanistan, knowing that that was not going to end war in Afghanistan, but it would take out the direct US engagement, that this is not really a moment of celebration. The US pullout did not bring the liberation of Afghanistan. This is much harder than, for example, in Vietnam, when the US defeat was a real mark of liberation for the people of Vietnam. It's not quite the same in Afghanistan. And I think that something that our mutual friend Malalai Joya, who many of us have known over the years, has said over and over again that I've always sort of carried with me when I think about what we should be saying and thinking and doing about the US war in Afghanistan. Malala had a very pragmatic approach. She was the youngest member of the US imposed parliament that was created after the overthrow of the Taliban-led government in 2001. She was one of very few women and the youngest person, and was immediately under great attack from other members of the parliament. She was facing death threats for many years. And when asked, well, what do you think? You know, you as a woman, you as part of civil society, what do you think about the US pulling out? What do you think that would mean for you? And her answer was very clear. She said, we in Afghanistan, we women, we in civil society, we have three enemies. The Taliban is certainly our enemy. The warlords disguised as a parliament are our enemy. And the US occupation is our enemy. And then she said, if you in the West can get rid of one of them, we'd only have two. And I thought that's a very pragmatic, practical way to think about this. It's not going to end the challenges facing Afghan women. But as Sonali so powerfully reminds us, Afghan women have had to fight for every one of their rights for generations. Way before the Soviet intervention, way before the US interventions, there are several. So, you know, we're looking at a long history of struggle that's not going to be over with the US troops out. So that's what we have to sort of keep in mind. This is a long struggle, and it's not going to be over for a long time. The issue of this war, a war that was waged for vengeance and not for justice, that was waged for ideological reasons, not even for clear political or strategic gain from the US, where the leader of the US side, the George Bush administration, and Bush himself, remains a war criminal. You know, there's an effort underway to kind of rehabilitate George Bush and say, well, he's now painting pictures of puppies after 4 years of Trump. Really, can we complain about George Bush? And the answer is yes, we can and we must. He remains a war criminal. And when we talk about obligations, one of them is accountability. That's one of the things that we have to fight for. But I would say one other thing, which is that our movement of 20 years has had extraordinary successes at changing public opinion that made possible and indeed made necessary the Biden administration's decision finally to pull out the troops and end the US involvement directly in the war in Afghanistan. And I say that because when we all remember, many of us remember, that when the war began in 2001, within 3 weeks of the 9/11 attacks, 88% of the population of this country thought it was a great thing. They thought it was about justice, that was going to bring justice for this horrific crime that had been carried out on September 11th. And what we see now is that as of May of this year, 62% of the population of this country approved fully of a full US withdrawal. That's a huge shift. And it didn't just happen because the US was losing, because as we remember, most of that we didn't know. I mean, many of us sort of knew it, we assumed it, but we didn't have the evidence of it. We didn't have it in the mainstream press that the US was losing. The military knew it, and they lied. They lied to the American people, they lied to the president, they lied to Congress, they lied to the press, they lied to each other. They pretty much lied across the board. A lot of people ended up believing that, not surprisingly. Not everybody did, thankfully. But the transition from 88% supporting the war to 62% saying we support full withdrawal, that happened partly because our movement succeeded at convincing people, at educating people, at showing people what this war meant, that the US had abandoned the women of Afghanistan long before. One of the points that Sonali raised that is so important, that when the Taliban were in power, Afghanistan was number one in infant mortality in the whole world. Today, after 20 years of US occupation and war, a war that was supposedly waged at least partly to defend the rights of women, Afghanistan is still number one in infant mortality. It's the worst place in the world for a child to be born and survive to her first birthday. The worst place in the world. It would still be number one in maternal mortality, if not for the fact that 3 incredibly impoverished sub-Saharan African countries' healthcare systems pretty much collapsed in the last 2 years. So it's now number 4 instead of number 1. but it is still one of the worst places in the world for a woman to give birth and survive. So that's what abandonment of the women of Afghanistan looks like. So when we talk about we should not abandon the women of Afghanistan, it's like, yeah, damn straight we should not. We should not have over 20 years. Because as we know, you don't bring liberation to women at the barrel of a gun. Liberation looks like healthcare. It looks like enough to feed your child. And those are the things that we have continued to deny the women of Afghanistan. In the speech that he gave justifying the US pullout from Afghanistan, there was a couple of things that that Biden said that were right. They were accurate and it was important. One was that it was right to get out, despite the horrific lack of clarity, lack of strategy, lack of planning in how they got out. It was right to get out. It was also right to talk about the economic cost, the cost of $2 trillion. And we're just talking here about Afghanistan. The war in Iraq was even more. But just for the war in Afghanistan, $2 trillion, one of those numbers that is so enormous that you might as well say a gazillion dollars for all that it means anything. But he broke it down. Biden broke it down. He said that it translates to $300 million a day. Put that up against what the costs are that we are told we can't afford for a Green New Deal. We can't afford Medicare for all. We can't afford a real jobs program. We can't afford to deal with the climate crisis. We can't afford. But somehow, when the war comes around, we can afford it all. We can afford it all and we pay it all. So that's one of the two reasons we have to cut the military budget. The other is, and it's just as important, is so we stop killing people around the world. The economic part of it is really important. It's a crucial starting point for people who are suffering themselves, the 140 million people in this country who are poor or low wealth. One kid falling out of a tree accident that will destroy their economic life. They may lose their house, their job, their car, their ability to provide for their family. For all those people, hearing the costs of these wars is a huge component of what it means to pay attention to these wars when you're struggling every day just to survive in this country, the wealthiest country in the history of the world. But the other side of it is just as important, the moral argument that says we have to cut the military budget so we don't go around the world killing people and thinking we can get away with it. It doesn't cost anything. We can always afford it. Both those reasons have to be at the core of how we do our organizing. So when we talk about a new set of relations with Afghanistan, a new era, new kinds of relations with Afghanistan, we need to keep in mind all of those problems with the old era. That yes, there were gains for women in Kabul and in Kandahar, but the vast majority of women in the rural areas, the 75% who don't live in those big cities, they never got those advantages. They remained impoverished. They remained without rights. Some of them did get a chance to go to some school. There were negotiations that went on quietly between Taliban forces, warlords, the Afghan government, informally, small scale. Schools were part of that. Girls' education was part of that, sometimes in some places, but never enough, never guaranteed, never a right. Rights have to be fought for, or else they're not rights at all. They're just privileges for the few. So that's what we're dealing with here. We don't know if the Taliban has changed at all in the 25 years since they came to power. And we won't know that for a while. My guess is they haven't changed very much. But what has changed is the world in which they are taking power. It's a different world. Afghanistan is a different country. Yes, it's still impoverished. Yes, it's still isolated in some ways. But I don't know how many of you saw the photograph of the Taliban officials, fighters, who with their weapons were in the presidential palace in Kabul the day they marched into Kabul. They were in the office of the president, surrounding his desk. And half a dozen of them had their cell phones out. They were taking selfies. That's a huge sign of the difference, where people in Afghanistan, and it's not only the Taliban, it's not only the people in the major cities, although it's mainly there, but even in smaller towns, people have access to cell phones for the first time. There's a little bit of access to the internet. People are in touch with the rest of the world in ways that they were not 25 years ago. That's a huge distinction that is going to make it a very different country for the Taliban to think they can rule. Kabul was not a modern city of 6 million people as it is today. They're going to need that technological work of women that only women know how to do in the banking system, in the healthcare system. They're going to be forced into making some changes that are not going to reflect at all what they want, what they believe. So I think that we have to wait a while to see what changes there may or may not have been on that scale. But the changes that are going on right now are the changes that are going to force some kinds of change. That includes, for example, the fact that COVID is rampant in the country. And the United States right now has put a halt on the IMF allowing Afghanistan to get access to $450 million worth of COVID vaccines under the special drawing rights of the IMF for poor countries. $450 million, which is chump change. That's a day and a half of the war cost of the US war. Remember, we said it was $300 million a day? A day and a half of that is $450 million. That's exactly what the US is now preventing the IMF from allowing Afghanistan to draw to get its vaccines for COVID. That's not going to be acceptable when more people know about it. So that's got to be one of our demands on our government. Stop preventing Afghans from getting access to vaccines. That goes for the refugees who are coming here, the humanitarian parolees who come without any guarantees of government support. That has to change. Our obligations now are to the people of Afghanistan, to the women, to the children, to the men. And that means to the refugees, the people who are afraid for their lives, they should have the right to get out. And those that are coming here should come without caps on the refugee numbers, without restrictions about what it takes a year and a half to file the paperwork for the special immigrant visas. That has to end. And we have to take responsibility for the people that remain in Afghanistan, the tens of millions of people for whom Afghanistan is still home and who still need massive levels of international support. One of the things the US did when it invaded and occupied the country was to impose a Western-based economy that is based thoroughly on US and international assistance, which has now stopped. Some of you may have heard the regional director of the World Health Organization the other day on NPR, when they were asked, what's the main problem? What's the biggest challenge you face right now in Afghanistan? He said, the biggest problem we face is that in 3 days, 2,200 clinics and hospitals across the country are going to close because the West is refusing to send the money that has kept those hospitals alive. 2,000 hospitals on one day this week are going to close. That's the kind of humanitarian crisis that is facing the people of Afghanistan. And that's what we now need to focus on in terms of our obligations. Getting people at risk out, supporting the refugees, supporting the asylum seekers, expanding those categories of people who can come in. That's number one. Number two, it means permanently ending the bombing raids, the drone strikes, the CIA and special forces raids throughout the country that could begin again. I don't think there's too much intention right now in the White House to begin that again, but we can never assume that it will not start again. So we have to keep up the pressure on that. We have to keep up the pressure on the US to push for all the international efforts to create humanitarian categories and humanitarian corridors and humanitarian access for aid workers and for the aid itself, for food aid, for water, for seeds, for farmers, all of these things to get into the country right now, all those things that are so desperately needed. We have to make sure we are funding, not just stop prohibiting the IMF from allowing Afghanistan to get its $450 million worth of COVID vaccines. We have to be funding millions and millions and tens of millions of dollars more for COVID vaccines and COVID treatment in Afghanistan. We have to press for open borders for anybody who wants to leave, to be allowed to exit, and welcome them to the United States without limits. And when we talk about aid, that means money. That means dealing with this government that's going to be in power. It doesn't mean necessarily full diplomatic relations, but it does mean not imposing sanctions, It does mean being willing to deal with this administration as they have been. As we know, we heard this from Sonali a minute ago. You all have seen it on TV. The US is negotiating consistently on a daily basis with the Taliban government as it's coming together on issues like which planes will be allowed out, how to open the airport, all of those questions. If they can do that, they can deal with the question of how do we get money in to support the hospitals being able to be reopened? How do we make sure that the local clinics in tiny villages, the only medical care that people have access to, are not shut down for the lack of funds coming in internationally? Because we know from the example of Iraq, if we ever needed another one, what economic sanctions mean for a country. We can say we're sanctioning Saddam Hussein, we're sanctioning the Taliban. And who suffers? It's the people. It's not the government, no matter who the government is. We know that when Madeleine Albright said, we think the price is worth it, that 500,000 children in Iraq had been killed by sanctions. That's not an acceptable price anywhere, including in Afghanistan. So we have to fight against the imposition of economic sanctions. We have to stop the inability of Afghans to access their own funds that are frozen in various accounts in the US and in Europe and elsewhere. And we have to stop the cycle of violence that the US is threatening to begin again at any given moment. This notion of over-the-horizon drone strikes as a continuing threat to the people of Afghanistan. We have to be the ones that will fight against that. We owe an enormous debt to the people of Afghanistan. We owe compensation for the destruction, the massive destruction we've brought to their country and to their people. We owe reparations, humanitarian aid, development aid, and payment for all that we have destroyed in that country. That means cutting the military budget so we can never go to war again. You know, the 10% that Barbara Lee is calling for now, a 10% cut in the military budget, that means about $74 billion. That's almost twice the amount that the US pays every year for the State Department and USAID combined, for diplomacy and development combined. That's $80 billion. $74 billion, that's only 10% of the military budget. That shows the priorities of our country. And that's what has to change. We have an enormous amount of work to do to make that possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phyllis. Great honor to have you with us. And you have such a wealth of information. Your recommendations make so much sense. Have you written them down in an article or anything? Or are you?
Well, they're in various articles. Some of them are in the Nation piece. I think not the last Nation piece, but a couple of a few weeks ago.
Okay, well, at any point, if you want to post whatever you've written that you want to share with us, and same for you, Sonali,
Sure.
Go right ahead in the chat. I do want to urge people to stay for the end of the call when we will be writing to President Biden about these pressing demands that Phyllis raised on freezing the funds and contributing to UN efforts and international agency efforts to address the humanitarian crisis, cease the drone strikes, and so forth. So do stay with us, please. So right now we're going to have a Q&A. We're taking questions from the chat. Medea, would you like to start?
Yes, I wonder if, Sonali, we can test your audio first. Can you
Sure. Testing 1, 2. How's that?
it's still the static.
Happy? Oh man, I'm sorry.
Well, we'll carry on.
Yes. So let's see. I'll start out with a question for Phyllis. If the how big a threat is ISIS in Afghanistan, and would you how would you feel about any cooperation between the United States and the Taliban to fight ISIS?
Very good questions, Medea, thanks. I think that ISIS-K, which is a small militant extremist organization, is a threat to people in Afghanistan. It is certainly not a threat to the United States. It is a threat to Afghans because it can carry out with very little funding, very little small weapons, small numbers of people. It can carry out attacks on ordinary people. So is it a threat? Yes. What does it mean that the US is in fact already, whether we like it or not, is already collaborating with the Taliban against ISIS-K. I think what it means is that whenever they manage to claim that they've had victory against ISIS-K, we're going to see the rise of ISIS-L next, and we'll see the collaboration of the US with ISIS-K against ISIS-L, because the lesson here is there is no military response to terrorism. It doesn't work. It kills more people than the terrorists ever can. So what we're dealing with is a situation where when we talk about what would it mean for the US to collaborate with the Taliban against ISIS, it means that we're assuming that there's somehow a military solution. And if we just get the right collaborations, we can take them out. We can't, we won't, we don't. This is not whack-a-mole. You know, this is the game that they like to play, the carnival game where, you know, a head pops up and you pound it down and it pops up somewhere else and you pound it down there, pops up somewhere else, and you keep pounding it down, and pretty much you've killed everybody around them. But those people still keep popping up. The only way to deal with terrorism is long-term. There's no short-term fix. There's no military solution that you can, if you send B-52s instead of F-16s, oh, well, that'll do it. That just kills more people, creates more martyrs, creates more hatred, and it creates another cycle of violence. But mostly it kills people. If we look at what happened after that horrific attack at the airport, for instance, which was claimed by ISIS-K, the US responded with a drone strike. This one wasn't over the horizon. Soon it will be, presumably. And they immediately said, well, we killed 2 leading members of ISIS-K and we stopped an imminent attack. And others said, yeah, well, maybe, let's just check that out. And as we know now, we don't know whether anybody from ISIS-K was killed. The Pentagon has kind of backed off from that claim. They haven't said it's not true, but they haven't been mentioning it for a while. What we do know is that at least one family of 10 people, 7 of whom were children, 4 of them under 5 years old, were killed in that strike. Who benefits? Who benefits from that? Who is hurt by that? If there were 2 people from ISIS-K killed, okay, what do they get? They get 2 new martyrs. It doesn't stop acts of individual terror like this. There are solutions, but they are long-term. They're not easy. They don't take effect right away. And they need issues of social and economic and all kinds of changes in the society, the kinds of things that lead people to turn to extremism, to end. As long as those things continue, terrorism will remain a significant threat in lots of parts of the world. It is not a threat to the United States. It is not something that can be solved by bombing, by special forces, by CIA. They can kill a lot of those people for sure, and more will come to replace them. That's the problem that we face.
Thank you, Phyllis. I have a question from the chat for Sonali. And this is broadly speaking, to what degree is there a feminist movement in Afghanistan? Are there any prominent male allies of feminist organizations within Afghanistan? What is the prognosis for women right now in Afghanistan?
There would be a better, stronger, bigger, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, there would be a bigger, stronger movement of Afghan women had the US and other countries not spent so many decades interfering in Afghanistan. I think the movement has generally been underground. It has been localized. It has been in the refugee camps in Pakistan and Iran. When it has been able to be active, it's been inside Afghanistan. When I traveled to Afghanistan many years ago to research my book, this was early on in the US occupation, we met many men who were allies of women. They weren't prominent, to be a prominent ally of women just as dangerous as being a prominent women's rights activist. As Malalai Joya knows, when you speak out publicly about women's rights, you become a marked person. So a lot of the activism, a lot of the organizing is underground. There's definitely been a lot of activity at Kabul University among students. But from what I experienced in traveling to Afghanistan, ordinary people, ordinary Afghans, men want their wives to be able to work. Fathers want their daughters to have education. It's it's not that different from other countries. So, but yeah, it's tough to organize when you are constant war and grinding poverty. So it's not as strong as it could be or should be. And if it were, then the rights would have been more advanced.
Sonali, can I just add on to that question that there seems to be a debate among some women groups now saying that the US should not recognize the Taliban. And how do you respond to that?
I mean, I think we should always be really careful about requiring anything off the US government, because the US government's never really done anything constructive. In not recognizing the Taliban, we should ask ourselves, what effect would that have in Afghanistan? Might it push the Taliban to be more hardline? It might. We would like the US to not befriend and empower and reward the Taliban, but do we necessarily want the US to make enemies of the Taliban? I don't know, and I don't think so. Instead, the US government could do so many other things. We could engage with the international community on disarmament efforts. We could work with the International Criminal Court on war crimes tribunals. There's been an effort. The Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, or Council, which was part of the US-backed Afghan government, had a whole report some years back, a detailed report about the importance, the need for international war crimes tribunals and accountability for war criminals. That includes the Taliban, that includes the US-backed Mujahideen. The US could support that. So if we are asking for the US to take action now, it should be in ways that are constructive. And it should be, as Phyllis was saying, on things like reparations, direct assistance to the Afghan people. There's some question that the sanctions, the financial sanctions that have frozen the assets of the Taliban, are actually not constructive. The US could sanction individual Taliban members rather than blanket sanctions. The blanket sanctions will only hurt ordinary people. And so, yeah, everything that we ask the US government to do, we have to be asking ourselves, will that have a positive or negative reaction on the people? Alienating the Taliban right now is not going to have a positive or constructive result for Afghan people. Embracing them isn't either.
Thank you, Sonali. Phyllis, let's talk about the economics for a minute. It seems so contradictory. On the one hand, Biden stands almost alone, at some point, calling for the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and is broadly criticized, not from the left, but from mainstream corporate media. But then at the same time, you have him saying that he's not going to backtrack on these sanctions, and he's going to continue freezing the assets in the banks, the $14.5 million or billion rather. Do you think there's any division within the Biden administration? Is Antony Blinken, is he behind these sanctions? What's going on here? Oh, we can't hear you.
Sorry. I don't think we know, or at least I don't know exactly who are the forces that are dividing within the White House. I think part of the problem is that there is a broadly held view in Washington between parties, in the media, in the White House, in the Congress. In the main, people believe a fiction. They believe that sanctions are an alternative to war. We don't want to go to war. Let's impose sanctions instead. They don't understand that sanctions are not an alternative to war. Sanctions are an act of war. They're a different kind of weapon. They're a weapon without guns and bombs, but they kill people just as seriously. In the case of Iraq, of course, they killed far more people than all the guns and bombs combined. So sanctions are an act of war. And the notion that this is somehow what we do when we don't want to go to war, because we promised to get out of war. We promised to end the war. So we're going to end the war. We're going to pull out all the troops. Sometimes, this time it doesn't seem to have been the case. This time they seem to be including in ending the war, pulling out the troops. They do seem to be, they've pulled out the Air Force. They've pulled out most of the contractors. There's only a few left. All of that could change. But for the moment, it's been a far more total withdrawal than we've seen in other withdrawals in other countries. But we have not yet seen a shift in the understanding of what sanctions represent, that they are an act of war. So I think we have to start from that vantage point and even talk about it using their language. If Biden is serious about ending the US war, it means he has to end the sanctions because sanctions are an act of war, period, full stop. And then we talk about it. What does that mean? Why do you say that? How can you make that claim? Sanctions don't kill people. It's like, well, actually, yes, they do. And here's an example of it. So I think that that's what we need to be focused on. It's good to have the specifics in mind, the 450 million at the IMF, the 9 billion that are frozen assets in US accounts. The problem is when we get to sort of the alternative of saying, well, what if we had individual sanctions against individual leaders? The problem is, what are we talking about there? In principle, I have no problem with that. In principle, there's plenty of people around the world I'd love to see sanctioned as individuals. But let's be clear, when we're talking about, for example, Taliban leaders, they don't exactly have an account at Chase Bank, right? So what are we talking about here? What are we going to do to sanction them? If we sanction them and say, well, we're not going to allow them to travel, well, that's going to be very useful at the point where we decide we actually want to talk about how do we ensure that there are open borders so that more Afghans who have whatever, European visas, US passports, whatever it might be, want to get out, can get out. We need to talk to them. So if we say they can't travel, maybe we also can't talk to them. So all of these things, as Sonali just said so brilliantly, all of these things have a downside. Nothing just happens in a vacuum. Nothing happens that just affects the Taliban and doesn't affect people. So we have to look at what's the impact on the people.
So we have, I think we're getting close to when we have to wrap up. I just wanted to throw out a couple of questions that people have asked, if you want to answer any of them, and then we'll move on to the action portion. So one question is about what's happening in the Panjshir Valley, the resistance there. Is that something that is that should be supported by progressives or not? Then another is a question is about the role of Pakistan. And another question is about the opium production. And when we talk about Afghanistan moving into a more sustainable economic model that isn't dependent on foreign aid, certainly we don't want to see opium production being the source of revenue. What might you say about that?
So those are a lot of questions, Medea.
Just take whichever you want. Yeah.
I can take the Panjshir Valley question real quick, and then I have to jump off. I'm so sorry. No, we should not support the Panjshir Valley resistance. This is the Northern Alliance. It's being led by Ahmed Massoud, the son of Ahmed Shah Massoud, one of the top, most, very notorious Mujahideen warlords that the US had supported and the CIA had supported. And this is basically like a redux of what happened in 2001 when the Northern Alliance the Mujahideen rebranded themselves as the Northern Alliance, moved to the top part of the country, the northern part of the country. And the US saw them as allies in the fight against the Taliban. And then in exchange for their help against the Taliban, rewarded them with weaponry, political power, etc. Ahmed Massoud, was given an op-ed in the New York Times about why everybody should now support the Afghan resistance. And they're very good at romanticizing these sorts of armed militias. The progressive movement in the US should absolutely not fall for it. These are the ideological brethren of the Taliban. They are the enemy of Afghan women. They cannot fuel more war because that's all that's going to happen. All that will happen if the US or anyone supports that armed resistance is yet another civil war and yet more cycles of violence, and definitely not a good situation for Afghan people or Afghan women. It was the civil war that groups like those that formed the Northern Alliance were fighting with one another, that devastated Afghanistan, that resulted in tens of thousands of people killed, that then paved the way for the Taliban to come in and say, we will bring peace to Afghanistan and end this bloody civil war. So no, I do need to leave. My kids are hungry and I have to make dinner.
Your children, thank you so much.
Sonali. You're brilliant.
Thank you, Sonali.
Bye. Thanks.
Maybe a few last words from Phyllis on any one of those questions or whatever you
Well,
want.
I would just repeat this question of not supporting. One of the other questions in the chat was, who are the good guys among the armed actors? In my view, there are no good guys among the armed actors, and no escalation in fighting is going to be useful for the people of Afghanistan. Nobody's going to win. Just like in this war, the US lost, but the people of Afghanistan didn't exactly win from this war. So we need an end to the full war, not just to the US war. That was step one, but it's not step last. So we still have a lot of work to do. And the bottom line is to step one step back and say, what do we owe to the people of Afghanistan, whose country, whose people we have destroyed so thoroughly over these 20 years? And that means we do not owe occupation and war. We do owe reparations, an end to sanctions, humanitarian support, development support, all the things that were in fact denied in the 20 years that we were being told they were being brought, and they were not. So we have 20 years of lies to make up for with some truth, with some money, with some solidarity. That's what has to come next.
Thank you so much, Phyllis. I'm going to ask everybody to please unmute. Shay, if you can help us unmute, and our participants can thank Phyllis.
Thank you, Phyllis.
That was
Thank you,
great.
Phyllis.
Great. Thank you.